I mean, it just sounds like that's the sound of living in Detroit. You just, any highway you're on, you're gonna... Better than food, man. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Better Than Food Book Reviews. I'm your host, Clifford Lee Sargent. Great to see you as always. Hope you're doing well. Get that coffee. Delicious. So we survived Milton. Turns out it was not Paradise Lost after all, though we thought it might be for a minute there. As a coincidental provocation of the wrath of Poseidon during the hurricane, I was reading today's book, Please Kill Me, The Uncensored Oral History of Punk Rock by Legs McNeil and Gillian McCain, published in 1996. Great photo there of the Heartbreakers on the cover. This Misfits shirt was sent to me by my friend and patron James. Thanks a bunch, man. Really appreciate it. And it was kindly modified by my wife for the weather in Florida. I love the Misfits. Danzig era, of course. So Legs McNeil is an author and one of the co-founders of Punk magazine, which started in 1976. And Gillian McCain is also an author and was the chair director of the poetry project at St. Mark's Church in the Bowery, where Patti Smith used to do readings in the early 70s, as the book informs us. So these two came together and created this incredible historical document. This book is a work of oral history, which the authors define and discuss in an essay following the main book, detailing their stylistic approach and telling us a little bit about the form's history. Historically, this oral history form was not possible until relatively recently, because of the immense amount of documentation, right? In Please Kill Me, the authors construct the narrative of punk rock's birth and self-destruction through a curated selection of quotes from interviews with the major and minor characters involved, including Lou Reed, Nico, Patti Smith, Iggy Pop, the New York Dolls, Johnny Thunders, the Dictators, Malcolm McLaren, the Ramones, Richard Hell, the music manager and journalist Danny Fields, Debbie Harry, Lester Bangs, Alan Vega from Suicide, Bob Gruen, the photographer, who took many of the great photos you've seen from this era, Mary Herron, who wrote for Punk magazine and went on to be a filmmaker directing American Psycho, top notch, David Bowie, the Dead Boys, Sid and Nancy, James Chance of the Contortions, William S. Burroughs, and many more. The New York venues where these bands played are also major characters in the book. Max's Kansas City and CBGB's. The genre seemed to have been born in those two venues. That's like hallowed ground for the genre. Of course, they've long since closed, but yeah. But also, you know, there's the Cafe Bazaar and the Electric Circus. My father-in-law used to go to the Electric Circus in New York back in the 70s. I was thinking he was probably actually like bumping into, unknowingly, the Velvet Underground and probably Warhol's, you know, factory group kind of in the area. I really wonder. Oh, he might have actually been going there in the 60s, late 60s. I'm not sure, I'll have to ask him. As we learn in the book, the title came from a t-shirt that Richard Hell made himself in the 70s. He just took a t-shirt and he wrote on it, Please Kill Me. As the book informs us, he didn't wear it in public. People in New York around that time might have fulfilled his request. Richard Lloyd, who was also in the band Television along with Hell at the time, did wear the shirt once, playing a show, I think. And this group of guys came up to him at the show and they were like, "Are you serious?" New York in the 70s was something else. Please Kill Me is a fantastic historical document for any fan of punk rock, or rock and roll in general, you know? And for the majority of my life, I have definitely been a big fan of punk rock. The book is filled with outrageous anecdotes from all the eras of the genre it covers, from its origins in New York and Detroit, to what could be argued as the genre's death following the death of Sid Vicious. Throughout the book, you are given a whirlwind of personalities, and each section chronicles the rise and downfall of various bands and characters. And while the bands fail or break up, or people die, you can see how each era influences the next, and the cycle splits off and restarts, reinvigorated, building upon what came before it, right? The whole book is written with an immense respect for the genre and the people involved, but it does not glamorize the trajectory at all. And you come to discover that the people who pioneered this machine, right? While sometimes having an amazing time filled with chaotic decadence, what seems like non-stop sex, drugs, and partying, also lived extremely unstable lives and were often broke or addicted to drugs or both, and generally had serious problems. The fact that some of them lived through it seems like nothing short of a miracle. The book is filled with people facing dark psychological struggles. And speaking of psychological struggles, today's video is sponsored by my friend Alice Dubois, who wrote an awesome illustrated memoir entitled Everything Depends on Me, a book about OCD. This is Alice's personal saga of growing up with OCD and finally realizing that OCD was the cause of so many feelings and behaviors. It's kind of a love letter to all the wonderful people who shared their OCD stories throughout history and helped Alice cope with hers. Every page is a full-colored, hand-illustrated, hand-lettered work of art. It's got a kind of punk comic vibe to it. It is really something. I've never read a book quite like it. It's a great book to learn more about OCD if you have it, or if you wonder what it feels like to have it. It's also about anxiety and depression and how those traits can run in families and cause major dysfunction. The book is full of literary and cultural references. R. Crumb, Jane Campion, Glenn Gould, Akira Kurosawa, Samuel Johnson, Robert Altman, Samuel Beckett, and S.E. Hinton, to name a few. It's also full of lowbrow or just plain weird references, like Bozo the Clown, Britney Spears, The Wizard of Oz, Deep Purple, the show Girls, the movie As Good as It Gets, Bubble from Absolutely Famous, and Alice's fear of Mr. Bubble, you know, the pink bathtub brand illustration. The first half of the book is Alice's story, and the second half is a chronicle of many other people with OCD, like David Sedaris, Samuel Johnson, Glenn Gould, and others. I particularly like the stuff in Glenn Gould personally. Isn't this a beautiful illustration here? That's great. At least one famous individual in this book had it as well. Joey Ramone, lead singer of the Ramones. So if you have OCD, or you suspect you do, or just like cool, unique illustrated books, please pick up a copy by clicking the link below in the description. It helps support Alice and it helps support the show. And thanks very much to Alice for sponsoring the show. So some of you undoubtedly will already be fans of punk rock, but if you are new to this whole genre, and the early stuff. For copyright reasons, I can't play the music in the video, of course. However, I've linked to these songs I'm referencing in the description below, so you can find the links there for some of these tracks that I'm going to discuss by some of these major bands. This book is an exciting, visceral, and poignant reflection on a series of the most incredible moments in music history in the 20th century. A ferocious explosion of energy, a cultural nuclear bomb that goes off and sets fire in different territories across the region, turning into this immense inferno of music that changed the world. Sure, much of punk rock is no good, right? A lot of punk rock is no good. But the best is among the greatest music that money can buy, or that can be stolen, more appropriately. It's among the greatest music that one can shoplift. Not that I'm saying you should do that. So I'll give a kind of chronology of the genre with the bands as they do in the book. I'll touch on the major bands they cover, and I'll mention some anecdotes from the book mixed in with my own commentary. Obviously, I'll skip over some things because there's a lot. So as the book shows us, starting in New York, art culture, avant-garde theater culture, gay culture, and rock culture began to mix together. There was this frustrated and necessarily DIY spirit, fueled by drugs, a lot of drugs, which then started to manifest with these young people experimenting with strange forms of music. It kind of came out of the crowd around Andy Warhol and the Factory. So the story starts in the 1960s with Lou Reed, Nico, and the Velvet Underground, and the various personalities around them. Andy Warhol, who managed the Velvets, once having them play a New York annual meeting of psychiatrists, as well as characters like Edie Sedgwick and John Cale. Their first album with Nico came out in 1967, and that started something. The Velvet's music was obviously made with like no money, but there was something unbelievably strange and eerie and catchy and beautiful and kind of dangerous and otherworldly, not for mass appeal, right? It was art. It was art. Meanwhile, around this time in the late 60s in Detroit, Michigan, you had this heavy spirit of tough as shit rock and roll, which spawned the MC5, the Motor City 5. Kick out the jams, motherfucker. That was a big moment. Wayne Kramer, the guitarist for the MC5, explains the role of their environment to the music they made, noting that the band name MC5, according to him, sounded like it had been stamped out of the auto factories, comparing their music to drag racing engines. And you can totally hear it when you listen to Kick Out the Jams and it goes into the main riff. I mean, it just sounds like that's the sound of living in Detroit. You just, any highway you're on, you're gonna, like, that's what it's like to live there. It's intense, right? Driving in Detroit is something else, man, especially on a Friday night. It's just like a fucking pinball machine. Everybody's drunk. I couldn't believe that. They were the most docile on Friday night, actually. That was the way I was least afraid of them, because they're all completely drunk, and so they're just sort of like weaving like whales on the highway. You know, they're trying not to get caught, probably, so they're not speeding as much. It's when they're sober you gotta watch for them. In the mornings, it's just, oh my God. But the MC5, this is ground zero for punk rock, right? This is like the first of the first of the first. But then some friends of the MC5 in Ann Arbor, Michigan started a band. It was led by a young fellow named Jim Osterberg. Jim was a big fan of blues, and he had gone to Chicago to learn from blues musicians. While he was there and watching these guys play, and sometimes playing with them, he realized he couldn't possess that kind of natural approach to the music in exactly the same way they could, because they were very, very good. So he smoked a joint by himself one night near a sewage treatment plant in an industrial section of Chicago. And he knew he couldn't do the same things as those blues musicians, but he thought about what his version of that would look like, could look like, what it could be. Right? And this is all from the book. So he called this crew back in Ann Arbor to come pick him up, and thus was born one of the most important groups in the genre, and my personal favorite, the Stooges. And that was when Jim Osterberg became Iggy Pop. And, oh my God. See it rising? I just have to think about what those performances looked like, what that music sounded like, and All the hair on my arms just rises up. It's the most libidinally charged, totally confrontational, pure rock and roll there ever was. To dismiss the Stooges and Iggy Pop is to dismiss the art form itself. Frankly, it's to dismiss music itself, in my opinion. I mean, just the way that guy moves, literally, right? Physically. Iggy's genius was the incorporation of this weird spasmodic movement that matched the weird spasmodic music. Only moves that he could do. I mean, you gotta look at some of this film footage from back then. Check out that link below, link number 3 of their famous performance in Cincinnati, with Iggy Pop standing on the crowd. Timestamp 4:14. I mean, something was happening, man. That image of him, I had a leather jacket in high school with a patch that was sewn into it, with that image of him standing on the crowd. It's iconic. I mean, it was a serious moment. I remember getting to the first Stooges album, you know, I Wanna Be Your Dog was definitely one of my favorites, but when I got a hold of Funhouse, oh my God. I mean, Down on the Street must be the slickest opener I've ever heard. So much attitude. It's sexual and it's violent and it's like arrogant, but it's also just so cool. And when TVI comes on and you hear that opening, see, it's so hard to describe the primal intensity of hearing something like that. Really hearing something like that for the first time. Like maybe you've heard it and you didn't get it, but when you respond to it for the first time, you know, when you really hear it, it's nothing less than a religious experience. You undergo a metamorphosis, right? You're never the same. You're suddenly aware of your flesh and blood, and you just go unthinking fucking nuts. Rock and roll has the ability to wake people up on an unconscious level. Iggy had also seen the Doors perform in Ann Arbor, and in the first 2 Stooges albums, you can really hear the influence. On tracks like Ann in the first album, I mean, it just totally sounds like Crystal Ship, or Dirt in Funhouse, which is one of the, I mean, that's like, I mean, that's actually a very subdued track, but it's just so, oh my God, that must be one of the darkest songs ever written, but it's not, it doesn't immediately strike you that way. It's a very beautiful, crooning, meditative, strange experience. And yet it's also like self-destructive, of course. Dirt's a haunting, gorgeous song. As the book informs us, the Funhouse was the name of the dilapidated home in Ann Arbor where the Stooges lived. The Ashtons, Ron and Scott Ashton, and Iggy, and I can't remember who else lived there. Apparently TVI, you know, like the song on Funhouse, was a term used as a joke between Kathy Ashton and her girlfriends, Kathy being the sister of Ron and Scott Ashton, who were the brothers in the Stooges. I think there's been a lot of speculation on what TVI means. She's got a TVI on me, what does it mean, you know? What's TVI? It meant twat vibe eye. Like when a girl's interested in a guy, he might say, she's got a TVI on me, as the lyric goes. As we learn in the book, and all these anecdotes are from the book, Nico from the Velvet Underground had a TVI on Iggy, as did many, many, many women. And they began seeing each other. She gave, as the book informs us, apparently she gave him his first dose of the clap. It's a hell of a thing. Well, it was gonna happen. So this is one of the ways the book demonstrates the mingling of scenes, right? Here's what Iggy Pop thought about hearing the Velvet Underground for the first time. I thought this was pretty interesting. I'm not gonna do it in the Iggy Pop voice. I'm tempted to, but I'm not going to. The first time I heard the Velvet Underground and Nico record was at a party on the University of Michigan campus. I just hated the sound. You know, how could anybody make a record that sounds like such a piece of shit? This is disgusting. All of these people make me fucking sick. Fucking disgusting hippie vermin. Fucking beatniks, I want to kill them all. This just sounds like trash. Then about 6 months later, it hit me. Oh my God. Wow. This is just a fucking great record. That record became very key for me, not just for what it said and for how great it was, but also because I heard other people who could make good music without being any good at music. It gave me hope. So from the Stooges, the book goes to the New York Dolls, with Johnny Thunders on guitar. Jet Boy's my favorite song. And Johnny Thunders is going to become a recurring character throughout the book. He's a problematic genius. I mean, he's written some incredible music. Johnny Thunders wrote one of the saddest songs I've ever heard in my life, called Can't Put Your Arms Around a Memory. That's there's few songs that are as sad as that fucking song. It's beautiful though. I'm going to take a detour from the book chronology for a sec. At this time, a band was started in New York on the Lower East Side, which doesn't get mentioned much in the book. A little bit. It was the electronic duo Suicide with Alan Vega on vocals and Martin Rev on keyboards. That was a seriously good band. Pioneering. I think Alan Vega in the book describes seeing the Stooges and then realizing that everything that he was doing was bullshit. And so yeah, Iggy had a huge impact on him, big influence on him. But Suicide sounded nothing like the Stooges. It was this very deeply disturbing, strange, beautiful, melodic, but futuristic and just like genuinely terrifying sound. Like Frankie Teardrop is the scariest fucking song in history. I mean, like literally scary. I mean, I once listened to Frankie Teardrop from that first self-titled Suicide album, and I was in the dark coming home in rural Washington, and I remember first time he screams in that fucking song, I leapt about 2 feet up off the seat in this car, and then it just devolves from there into this cacophony of screams. I was listening to black metal at that time. I was listening to the most extreme stuff I could find, but nothing freaked me out as much as Frankie Teardrop. That is a terrifying song, and also just an existentially terrifying song because of what it's about. It's about this factory worker who's just losing it, you know? And the song takes you through that whole journey. And, you know, of course, then the other stuff, I mean, there's Ghost Rider, which is one of the catchiest damn songs of all time. And then, you know, their other album, which came in the 80s, A Way of Life, is also just like, I mean, hard-hitting. It's like industrial, synth punk, I guess is what they call it. But it's like, it's so ferocious, right? Really terrific stuff. I can't recommend Suicide's first album highly enough. They formed in 1970, but it took 7 years for their first album to come out. They became sort of associated with the genre that later came to be known as no wave. Very discordant, artistic, challenging experimental music. So then you have like Lydia Lunch and Teenage Jesus and the Jerks. Lydia Lunch is actually a voice that's missing from the book, which is interesting. I think she would have had some great things to say. She usually does. But I mean, Teenage Jesus was deranged in the best way. I mean, the sound. You know, I was so impressed with her when I was younger, as well as DNA and Mars. Oh my God, Mars, dude, you got to listen to Mars. That album. There's an album of their stuff called 78 Plus. That was, I mean, 3E and 11,000 volts. I mean, those are, I mean, it's like the Velvet Underground, but you could see the direct influence. The Velvet Underground was alluring and in a way kind of palatable and accessible, even though it was crunchy and lo-fi. But Mars was frightening, you know, kind of like Suicide. Wild music. Mars was in a totally different category. So, okay, we're in the early to mid 70s. This is when Patti Smith arrives. One of the only musicians in the book that I could never get into, unfortunately. I mean, Horses is okay. I love her taste, you know, but she just seemed, for some reason, like so affected to me. That whole thing, like the spoken word poetry and all that, the man kind of thing, like, but then I could never get into Bob Dylan either, save for his first album. I like that album. And Patti Smith was very influenced by Dylan. A lot of people will balk at my lack of enthusiasm for those two, but hey, there's no accounting for taste, right? William S. Burroughs appreciated Patti Smith, though. He was a friend of hers and he got it. And as the book tells us, she would do these poetry readings at the, St. Mark's Church in the Bowery. So I could never get into Patti Smith. However, another band mentioned is Television, with Tom Verlaine, who was hanging out with Patti Smith, and also featured among its members for a time Richard Hell, who left and went to start the Heartbreakers with Johnny Thunders after the Dolls ended, and eventually Richard Hell and the Voidoids. Richard Hell's album Blank Generation is another major album of the genre. For me, Television was one of the most incredible bands to come out of the scene. Listening to Marquee Moon still gives me goosebumps. That album is one of the most singular things I've ever heard in my life. I had the chance to see them in Detroit before Tom Verlaine died, and I'm just forever kicking myself for not taking the opportunity. So it takes 10 years from the first album by the Velvet Underground to get to Television's Marquee Moon in 1977. But you can absolutely hear the influence. Marquee Moon sounds like wandering around a strange, beautiful carnival at night. Melodies like nothing you've ever heard. So much interesting experimentation and surprising twists and turns. Kind of joyful, but laced with this tragic nocturnal longing. This kind of joyful melancholy, you know? I never understood Patti Smith. I almost immediately understood Television. But meanwhile, before Marquee Moon came out, in 1974, a band arrived called the Ramones, who once again changed the whole thing. Dee Dee Ramone is a frequent character in the book, one hell of a character. Used to hustle on the streets of New York for cash. That's what 53rd and 3rd is about. 53rd, 3rd! My favorite lyric. My favorite lyric of all time, maybe, because it's so fucking lazy and so fucking clever at the same time, is in the song Judy is a Punk. It's third verse, different from the first. It's almost like they run out of things to say, and then he just goes, third verse, different from the first, Jackie is a punk. Third verse, different from the first. Their songs are so short, and they just like, they don't care. Like, nobody cares. Like, you know, that's the thing about the genre. Like, it didn't matter that you couldn't play or write some sort of like, you know, genius thing. It was just all about energy, right? As the authors of the book describe, and people who are interviewed as well. I just love that. That just sums it up, you know? I'll put that link below as well. Around this time, Punk magazine starts, as the book explains, with Legs McNeil co-founding this publication with his friends. And they post these stickers up all around town that say, "Punk is coming," right? And their first interview was with Lou Reed, who, as expected, was a complete prick. As Legs says in the book, Lou was brilliant, but he was an asshole. This is sort of the unanimous opinion of Lou Reed. That's okay, you know? One thing he couldn't be called was boring. One time he tries to pick up this girl in a bar, and he asks if she wants to come over and shit in his mouth. Charming. There's a great one here about the birth of Punk magazine, with a little quote from William S. Burroughs chiming in as they brilliantly edited it. This is when James Grauerholtz, who was the manager of William S. Burroughs, is talking about Punk magazine. So on my little route from the bunker to Phoebe's, I would pass these street poles right outside my house with posters glued up. Punk is coming! And I loved it. From the first moment I saw that sign, I thought, Punk is coming. I thought, what is this going to be? A band or what? But punk, I loved it because it meant to me a derisory word for a young no-count piece of shit. And then from Burroughs' Junkie, you know, there's that great scene where William and Roy, the sailor, are rolling the lushes in the subway, and there's two young punks. They cross over and they give Roy a lot of shit, and Roy says, fucking punks think it's a joke. They won't think it's so funny when they're doing 529 on the island. You know, 5 months and 29 days. Fucking punks think it's a joke. So I knew that Punk was a direct descendant of William Burroughs' life and work. And I said, we've got to put these two things together for the benefit of all parties. And that's what I did. And then the next quote, which ends the chapter, is from William Burroughs himself. I always thought a punk was someone who took it up the ass. Brilliant. The book then goes on to cover the infamous Dead Boys. Sonic Reducer ain't no loser. Chaos ensues. They also have a very helpful list of the cast of characters to refer to in the back of the book, where you can find out a little bit about everybody who's quoted in the book, to keep on track here. In the 6 years from 1974 to 1980, you had so much happening, it was insane. Of course, you had the Sex Pistols, which the book covers, but you also had stuff in England happening like The Fall with Marquis Smith, one of the most uncompromising bands ever, and one of the most inaccessible. Hex Education Hour, I mean, and the pop group, you know, with their album Why. She is Beyond Good and Evil. That sound was so weird. Oh, I loved it. And Wire and Gang of Four. And then in Australia, you had The Birthday Party with Nick Cave. I mean, that might be my favorite. I mean, it's, you know, The Stooges, yeah, but The Birthday Party, for me, Roland S. Howard, Mick Harvey, and Tracy Pugh. Tracy Pugh is the greatest fucking bassist who ever walked the earth. That is the most shit-kicking, pummeling bass sound that has ever been produced. I mean, that dude died young, died at like 28 or something. And Roland S. Howard, I mean, his solo work, Teenage Snuff Film, amazing album, incredible album, horrifically depressing, but beautiful, beautiful music. And then, of course, Nick Cave, solo stuff, his early solo stuff, can't go wrong with that. I mean, but Swampland by The Birthday Party, I mean, the live album is better than the actual albums. I mean, like, the live album from 81 and 82 is, I mean, you listen to stuff like Sometimes Pleasure Heads Must Burn. Where is this coming from? You know, it's like, even when you understand the influences, I mean, like, some of this music just sounds, I mean, they were so, like, vicious looking too. I mean, they looked like a gang. The personalities in the 70s and the early 80s were so strong. I mean, it just striking personalities, very unique and creative. I mean, these people would just emerge from the scene, and you just, from all over the world, and you just be like, what is this? You know, it's just, and the Cramps in New York, and the Misfits in New Jersey, early Misfits, early Cramps. You want to talk about seasonal listening. The Cramps and the Misfits, there you go. The Misfits were not on Smack, actually. They were one of the few bands who did not seem to be tied in with drugs. They were all about, you know, 50s horror movies and lifting weights. It was quite a statement, quite a look But at this time, I mean, an astounding amount of good music. I mean, astounding. Nothing seen before or since. What's interesting about the whole image of punk, what we came to know as, the aesthetic of punk, is that, as the book informs us, Malcolm McLaren, who is from England, while over in the States and failing to properly manage the New York Dolls, who eventually dissolved, saw Richard Hell performing and fell in love with this image of a handsome young guy who looked dirt poor. So he went back to England and concocted this whole cultural fashion statement, which he spearheaded with the Sex Pistols, whom he managed. So the English version of punk was directly inspired by, nay, copied, from New York. All of a sudden you have kids doing strange things with their hair and safety pins, and acting as rude and snotty as they can. According to the book, Richard Hell's song Blank Generation was ripped off by the Sex Pistols with their song Pretty Vacant. Just the look of Richard Hell gave McLaren the idea of this punk archetype. Humorously, Richard Hell, by the time the English punk thing arrived in America, was kind of over it, understandably. I mean, he was approaching 30 and was just sort of, burnt out, as he says in the book. And this is Richard Hell talking here. I doubt that I was really ever cut out to perform, to make it my life's work. The only practice I ever got on the bass is either when I'm in rehearsal or writing songs. I've always thought of myself as a writer. I don't know, rock and roll is for when you're a kid anyway. Rock and roll is like a kid's game, A lot of it is based on that kick out the jams thing. This release of all this pent-up energy and frustration and anger and desire for attention that you have when you're that age. I was strung out. I was just very tired. Understandable. It's a lot of work to be a heroin addict, It's actually a surprising amount of work. Not that I know, but it's always the impression I get. Mark Lanigan, all these people I've read about. Think about working 80-hour weeks in accounting versus being an addict. Honestly, believe it or not, the heroin addict is probably working harder, ironically. I could talk to you for 6 hours about all the music I love in here. In retrospect, it seemed inevitable that I would find myself pulled into punk rock. It wasn't even an option, it was just something gut level, intuitive. But while these characters are legendary, fascinating, funny, genius sometimes, many of them, honestly, just seemed intolerable. It is one of the dirtiest books I've ever read. I mean, truly disgusting in some parts. Reading about Johnny Ramone watching Sid Vicious shoot up in the bathroom in London was just this horrific detail wherein you realize, oh, Sid's not playing around. He's really living up to the thing they've created for him. He's living up to this image. One of the funniest narrative threadlines in the book concerns this demented woman named Connie, who first dates Arthur Kane, the bassist in the New York Dolls, and ends up stabbing him in the thumb, and then she begins dating Dee Dee Ramone. The book describes this woman as just a terror, a psychopathic Amazon, and yet, when it chronicles her demise, which is expected and surprising to literally nobody, although she seems kind of indestructible at the same time, you do have this kind of tragic empathy for her. I mean, because it's dark. Her whole journey is just awful. And I suppose that's one of the many strengths of the book. In spite of these complicated low-life characters, who at the same time happen to be brilliant artists, as is often the case, in their moments of savage rage or narcissism or idiocy, the book captures and communicates their desperation and vulnerability, which is to say, it makes them human. Perhaps you would not want to hang out with these people if you know it's good for you. Or maybe you'd fall in love with them, as many did. What is so viscerally demonstrated in the book, as the authors say in so many words, and more than once I believe, is that at this time in history, you could be nobody. You could be a loser or a junkie or a wannabe with no money, no skills, no future, and you could start something. You could suddenly become a fucking pioneer. Ambition, attitude, and the seeming indestructibility of youth can take you a long way. The whole idea behind this type of rock and performance that served simultaneously as the highest criticism and the highest praise was that anybody could do it. As the lead singer of the New York Dolls, David Johansen, says brilliantly in the book, you didn't need money. You needed balls. And not even technically, as Patti Smith had a bigger pair than most men currently walking the globe. Yeah. Another thing I noticed was that back in this scene in New York, everybody was having sex with each other. Gay, straight, bi, whatever. Sex, physicality was everywhere. This was pre-AIDS after all. And this is so radically divorced from the contemporary era, where you'll notice that everything is sexualized, but in a weird commercial way which just exhausts you. And ironically, almost nobody's having sex with each other, according to the news at least. At this time in history, people liked hanging out with other people. Men and women were into each other, literally. They liked doing drugs together, getting into chaotic situations, falling in love, collaborating. And maybe I'm wrong, but that seems so different from this era where we find ourselves in this fragmented, hyper-competitive environment wherein the drugs are so poisonous they'll kill you instantly. It's obvious to me that there's no modern equivalent to punk rock. By comparison, it's a cultural ghost town. Every genre of every art form is derivative of the hordes of things that came before, born out of imagination. And I know that they were derivative too, in a sense, but seems like it's a little worse today. Not just music, not just film, everything. All art in general. Today, art in general, I'm calling it, is dead. Art is dead. Long live art. Maybe it ain't that bad, but man, some days it feels like it now. What I loved so much about the book was all the intersecting stories of all the scenes and characters, where you can really trace the origins of who met who that led to whatever. And all of these characters are utterly outrageous, stranger than fiction. In spite of all the degradation and addiction and despair and violence, it was absolutely beautiful in its own grotesque manner, this period of time that the book covers. It just must have been something extraordinary, you know? Just unbelievable to behold. It was literally happening in front of these people, on stage. And it was loud, bold, dangerous, and thrilling. We have absolutely nothing by comparison. Nothing, nowhere even close. But maybe things like that can only happen once in a century. And I'm glad it did, because we still have perhaps the most important thing. The music. Lou Reed is quoted in the book, "Rock and roll is so great people should start dying for it. You don't understand. The music gave you back your beat so you could dream. A whole generation running with a Fender bass. The people just have to die for the music. People are dying for everything else, so why not the music? Die for it. Isn't it pretty? Wouldn't you die for something pretty? Perhaps I should die. After all the great blues singers did die. But life is getting better now. I don't want to die. Do I? Would you die for the music? Perhaps it's arguable that some did. Perhaps some did it with gusto, deciding without question to sacrifice themselves however necessary, because that's how powerful it was. They went into what became punk rock head first with that attitude. Please kill me. Better than food. It's not for everybody, but man, it probably saved some people's lives even if they lost them in the process, you know what I mean? So what did I dislike about it? Well, you know, some voices are more interesting than others. Some can go on and kind of drag a little bit. I thought might be repetitive here and there, but overall, you know, I thought the quotes they used were very choice. There's just a very interesting tapestry they weave together from all these different people's voices. I was impressed, for sure. And I feel like I definitely have more of an understanding on how everything came to be. I would have liked to see other voices incorporated from characters in the scenes that I'm interested in. But the book is like pushing 500 pages, so I mean, you know, how much can you do? So you should read it. Well, obviously, if you're into punk rock or rock and roll, you might find it very compelling if you're interested in the origins of the genre. And also if you're into gritty nonfiction, like crime, right? It often feels like crime nonfiction. It often is crime nonfiction. And there's plenty of humor in there too. And I think Legs McNeil and Gillian McCain did a great job. It's really comprehensive. So hats off to them. Thank you very much for bringing us this book. Coffee time. For those of you who are new, thank you very much for stopping by and watching. I take all the names of the patrons on Patreon who are financially supporting the show and I place their names in this mason jar. And for every review, I pull out a name. And whoever's name I pull out is sent a hard copy of the book I'm reviewing, plus a bag of coffee, roasted by yours truly. And the coffee is delicious, currently from Brazil. If you would like to get in on that and help support the show, thank you very much. I sincerely appreciate it. You can click on the link below or go to patreon.com/books are better than food, and the tiers start at $5 per video. I usually make 3 to 4 a month. In addition, for becoming a paid patron, you'll get access to all this cool stuff. And international shipping is included. Thank you very much to all my patrons, and best of luck. Okay, here we go. And I hope whoever gets this, you enjoy punk rock. If not, we'll work it out. You'll get something that you'll enjoy. I mean, I understand it's kind of niche, right? Sam H. Thank you very much, Sam H. Really appreciate it. You're going to receive Please Kill Me by Legs McNeil and Gillian McCain, plus a bag of delicious coffee, roasted by yours truly, and I hope you love both. Cheers. Please subscribe if you have not already, and hit the thumbs up if you enjoyed this, and always remember, die reading. All right, thanks for watching. Take care of yourselves. Have a great night. Talk to you soon. Ciao.